Hey there everyone, Ramesh here, back again with another crash course on Spring Boot and Docker. In this crash course, you will learn how to Dockerize Spring Boot for projects. Well, if you are a beginner and if you don't know how to Dockerize a Spring Boot application, then this course is for you. So in this course, I'm going to explain each and every concept like how to Dockerize the Spring Boot application from start to end. Okay, so in this course, you will learn the Docker workflow. So this is very important. In order to understand how to Dockerize the application step by step from start to end, you need to understand the Docker workflow. If you are a beginner, then you have to understand the Docker workflow in order to Dockerize the complete Spring Boot application. Okay, and I am going to explain the Docker workflow at a beginner level so that you will understand the complete Docker workflow. Okay, next we will create a Spring Boot project and build some REST APIs. Next, we'll create a Dockerfile to build the Docker image. Well, I am going to explain you how you can create a Dockerfile to build the Docker image at a beginner level, so you don't need to have a prior experience on this. Next, we'll see how to build the Docker image from a Dockerfile. Next, we'll see how to run the Docker image in a Docker container. Next, we'll see how to push the Docker image to the Docker Hub. And finally, we'll also see how to pull the Docker image from a Docker Hub. So these are the very important steps, and these steps cover Dockerizing the Spring Boot application from start to end. And I'm going to explain each step in depth so that you will understand each and every concept of the Spring Boot and Docker. Well, I'm going to cover all the important Docker commands in this crash course, and you can use all those Docker commands in real-time projects. Alright, so without further ado, let us go and let us start this crash course with Docker workflow. Hi everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, let's take a look into the general Docker workflow. Well, this is a typical Docker workflow that we follow to Dockerize the application. As a developer, first we need to create a Docker file and we need to define all the instructions and commands in a Docker file to build the Docker image. Alright, so Docker file is nothing but a text file. It contains all the instructions or commands to build the Docker image. Once we create a Docker file, next we can use Docker build command to build the Docker image. Okay, so Docker image is nothing but an executable package and we can run this Docker image in a container. Alright, so Docker container is nothing but a running instance of Docker image. So this complete process is called Dockerization. Okay, so as a developer we need to create a Docker file and we need to define all the instructions or commands to build the Docker image, and we use Docker build command to build the Docker image from the Docker file, and then we can use Docker run command to run this Docker image in a Docker container. Here the Docker container is nothing but a running instance or a runtime instance of Docker image. Okay, so this complete process is called Dockerization. Next, once we have a Docker image in our local machine, then we can push this Docker image in a online cloud repository called Docker Hub. Okay, once we push Docker image in a Docker Hub, then we can pull that Docker image on any environment and we can start deploying this Docker image in a Docker container. For example, let's say we have different environments like staging environment, test environment, production environment, or UAT environment. Alright, once we push Docker image on a Docker Hub, then we can pull this Docker image on any environment and we can run that Docker image in a container. Alright, so this is how the typical Docker workflow looks like. Let's understand this general Docker workflow with an example. For example, consider we want to Dockerize the Spring Boot application. Then what we need to do is we need to create a Docker file first and we need to define all the instructions or commands to build the Docker image. Alright, so once Docker file is ready, then we can use Docker build command to build the Docker image from the Docker file. So here Docker image is nothing but an executable package. Next we can use Docker run command to run this Docker image in a container. So Docker container is nothing but a running instance or a runtime instance of Docker image. So this complete process is called a Dockerization. Well, once we have a Docker image on our local machine, then we can go ahead and push this Docker image on a Docker Hub using Docker push command. Okay, so once we push Docker image on a Docker Hub, and if we make this Docker image as a public on Docker Hub, then anybody can go ahead and pull this Docker image from the Docker Hub and they can run that Docker image in a Docker container. Okay, so this is how the typical Docker workflow looks like. In next lecture onwards, we'll see how to Dockerize the Spring Boot application step by step First, we'll create a Spring Boot application and we'll build some REST APIs. Next, we'll create a Dockerfile and we'll define all the instructions and commands to build the Docker image. Next, we'll see how to create a Docker image from the Dockerfile, and next we'll see how to run a Docker image in a Docker container, and next we'll see how to push a Docker image to the Docker Hub. So these are the steps that we are going to perform in order to Dockerize a Spring Boot application. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture. Hi everyone, welcome back. In previous lecture we have seen the general Docker workflow. In this lecture onwards we'll start Dockerizing Spring Boot application. Well, here are the development steps to Dockerize a Spring Boot application. First step, we'll create a Spring Boot application and we'll build some REST APIs. In second step, we'll create a Docker file to build the Docker image for our Spring Boot application. Next, we'll see how to build the Docker image from the Docker file. And next, we'll see how to run a Docker image in a Docker container. And next, we'll see how to push this Docker image on a Docker Hub. So these are the steps that we are going to perform in order to Dockerize a Spring Boot application. In this lecture, let's go ahead and let's create a Spring Boot application and we'll import that Spring Boot application in an IntelliJ IDEA. Alright. Well, the standard and easiest way to create a Spring Boot application is by using Spring Initializer. Spring Initializer is a web-based tool that allows us to quickly generate a Spring Boot project with all the basic configurations and dependencies. So let's go to our favorite browser. I'm using Google Chrome here. In a new tab, just type start.spring.io. This brings up the Spring Initializer website. Next, let's fill in the Spring Boot project information. At the top, we can choose the project type. We have different options: Gradle Groovy, Gradle Kotlin and Maven. We are going to use Maven, so let's select Maven project. Next, we can choose the language. Spring Initializer supports Java, Kotlin and Groovy. We'll go with Java, so let's keep Java selected. Next, we need to choose the latest version of Spring Boot. We want to use Spring Boot 4, so here select 4.0.0rc1. Avoid using snapshot versions. At the time of watching this video, you might see a different version, but make sure to use Spring Boot 4 or above. Don't choose a snapshot version because snapshot versions are unstable and meant for testing. Next, we'll fill up the project metadata. The first field is group. Let's give something like net.java guides. The group name is a unique identifier for your project, often based on your company or organization name. Next, we have artifact. This is basically the project name. Let's give it a name like Spring Boot-Docker-Demo. The project name will automatically match the artifact name. Next, add a description, something like demo project for Spring Boot and Docker. And for the package name, let's keep it as com.javaguides.springboot. Next, let's set the packaging type. We'll keep jar selected because we'll run this application as a standalone jar file and an embedded Tomcat server. Next, configuration. Keep properties as selected. Next, let's select the Java version. By default, it shows Java 17. You can use Java 25 or 21 as per your requirements. Now we need to add dependencies to our Spring Boot application. Click on Add Dependencies. Here you can search and choose the dependencies you want to include in your project. For example, if you want to develop a web application or REST API, type web and select Spring Web. Spring Web is a starter dependency that allows you to develop both web and RESTful applications. It also provides Apache Tomcat as the default embedded server. As of now, just keep this single dependency. Next, click on the Generate button. Notice that this project is downloaded as zip file. Next, unzip this folder and import in the IntelliJ IDE. Once we create a Spring Boot application and import in IntelliJ IDEA, next let's go and let's create one simple REST API. So go to base package over here, and here let me create one new package and let's give name as controller. Within a controller package, let's create one Java class and let's give class name as docker controller, something like that. And let's go ahead and let's annotate this controller class with add rest controller annotation to make this class as a Spring MVC REST controller, and within this controller we can define the REST APIs. So here just type public and let's give a return type of the method as string, and let's give method name as docker demo, and then let's return some string over here. Let's say dockerizing Spring Boot application. Alright, perfect. Next, let's go and let's annotate this method with add get mapping annotation. So this get mapping annotation will map incoming HTTP GET request to this particular method. Next, let's provide the REST API URL for this method over here. So let's give something like docker. Alright, perfect. Now we have built a simple REST API. Next, let's go and let's run the Spring Boot application and let us test this REST API. So here let me go to main entity point class, and from here I am going to run our Spring Boot application. Well, notice here our Spring Boot application is up and running in an embedded Tomcat server on port 8080. Next, let's go to browser. In a new tab, just type localhost :8080/docker, hit enter, and there we go. The client got the response of the REST API as a Dockerizing Spring Boot application. It means we have successfully created a Spring Boot application, and we have imported an IntelliJ IDEA, and also we have created one simple REST API. Next step is we need to create a Dockerfile, and we need to define all the instructions or commands to build the Docker image for a Spring Boot application. Alright, in next lecture we will see how to create a Dockerfile and how to define the instructions or command to build the Docker image. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture. Hi everyone, welcome back. In previous lecture we have created a simple Spring Boot application and we have built a simple REST API. In this lecture we are going to create Dockerfile and will define all the instructions or commands to build the Docker image. Alright, so if you go to browser and just search for Dockerfile and hit enter and go ahead and click on first link, it will navigate to the official Docker website. And if you want to know more about Dockerfile, you can go ahead and check out this documentation over here. Okay, so Docker can build images automatically by reading the instructions from Dockerfile. A Dockerfile is a text document that contains all the commands a user could call on the command line to assemble an image. It means that the Dockerfile is nothing but a text file. It contains all the commands or instructions required to build a Docker image. Okay, and the Dockerfile name should be same as Dockerfile. Okay, next let's go ahead and let's create a Dockerfile in our Spring Boot application and let's define all the instructions. So let me go to IntelliJ IDEA over here. Well, before creating a Dockerfile, let's go ahead and let's Maven build our Spring Boot application. We'll go to Maven section over here and go to project and go to lifecycle, and here just choose clean and package and go ahead and click on this run Maven build icon over here. So this will Maven build our Spring Boot application, and there we go, build success. And if you go to target folder, within the target folder Spring Boot Docker demo jar file is created. Okay, next we are good to create a Dockerfile. So go to Spring Boot project root directory over here, and here right click new and then choose file, and let's give file name as Dockerfile, and make sure that the file name should be same. Okay, and this D should be in uppercase. Next, within this Dockerfile, let's go ahead and let's define the instructions. Well, let's begin with from. Well, remember the Dockerfile always starts with from instruction. So we use from instruction to define the base image or a parent image for this image. Well, basically we can create a Docker image from another image which is available in a Docker Hub. For example, if you go to browser, in a new tab just search for Docker Hub and go to Docker Hub website over here and just search for Java and hit enter and just scroll down, and here you can see Java Docker official image. So go ahead and click on this. So this will navigate to the OpenJDK Docker official image. So if you can notice here, deprecation notice. Well, OpenJDK is deprecated and they are recommending to use these alternative official Docker images. Well, we are going to use Eclipse Tamarind as a alternative official Docker image. So go ahead and click on this Eclipse Tamarind over here and just copy this Docker image name and go to our project and go to Dockerfile, and after from just paste it and let's define the tag that is 17. So this will provide basically a Java 17. Okay, great. So remember, the Docker file always starts with from instruction, and we use from instruction to define the base image or a parent image. Okay, next let's go ahead and let's define the metadata. Well, in order to define the metadata, we can use a label instruction, and then we can use its attribute, that is maintainer equal to, and then we can define the email ID. For example, let's say javaguides.net@gmail.com. Next, let's create a working directory in a container. For that, let's use work directory instruction over here, and then let's define the directory name. Let's give directory name as a /app. Well, whenever we run the container, then app directory will be created in a container. Next, let's use copy instruction to copy source file from our system into a destination in a container. For example, we are going to copy the Spring Boot Docker demo jar file into a container. For example, copy, and then let's define the source. Source here is target/Spring Boot Docker demo jar file. So basically we are going to copy this jar file from our project into the app folder in a container. For example, if you look at the location of jar file, we have Spring Boot project, within that we have target folder, within that we have Spring Boot Docker demo jar file, right? So we are going to basically copy this jar file from our project into the app folder in a container. Okay, next the destination should be /app, and then within this app directory we are going to copy this jar file, and let's give jar file name something like Spring Boot Docker demo jar. Well, once we copy the jar file in a Docker container, next we need to start this jar file, right? For that we need to have a entry instruction over here, and then within a double square brackets we need to define the command java, and then second argument -jar, and then third argument the name of the jar file, that is Spring Boot Docker demo.jar. So let me copy this and paste it over here. Okay, so this is how we define the entry point to run the jar file. Now we have created a Docker file and we have defined all the instructions or commands to build the Docker image. In next lecture we will see how to build a Docker image from this Docker file. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture. Hi everyone, welcome back. In previous lecture we have created a Docker file and we have defined all the instructions to build the Docker image. In this lecture we will see how to build a Docker image from the Docker file. Well, before building a Docker image from the Docker file, make sure that a Docker desktop is running in your machine. For example, I have started a Docker desktop. Once a Docker desktop is running in your machine, then it looks like this. Okay, and using Docker desktop you can track the images and you can track the containers, volumes. Okay, so make sure that before building a Docker image from the Docker file, your Docker desktop is up and running in your machine. Okay, next let's go to our project, and in previous lecture we have created a Docker file. Within that we have defined these set of instructions, like we have a from instruction over here. So we use from instruction to define the base image or a parent image for this Docker image, and next we have used a label instruction to define a maintainer or a author. Next we have used the working directory as an app directory in a container. Well, whenever we deploy a Docker image in a Docker container, then this app directory will be created in a Docker container. Next we have used a copy instruction to copy this jar file from our project into the directory in a container. Okay, next we have used entry point to start the jar file in a Docker container. So these are the simple instructions that we have defined in a Docker file. Next we are going to use this Docker file to build the Docker image. Alright, so let's open the terminal Well, I'm using Mac operating system, so I can open the terminal over here. But if you are using Windows machine, make sure that you open the command prompt. Okay. Well, let me open a new cell. It has a background white. Okay. So let me zoom it a little bit. Next, let's go ahead and let's jump into our project. So just type cd and then downloads. Well, our project is present in downloads folder. So go to downloads folder. Within that we have a project that is Spring Boot Docker demo. Okay, so make sure that you are in a Spring Boot Docker demo project. Okay, because the Docker file is present within this project, isn't it? Next, let's go ahead and let's use docker build command to build the Docker image by using this Docker file. So here just type the command docker followed by build and then -t. So this option is to tag the Docker image and then followed by the Docker image name. So let's give Docker image name something like Spring Boot Docker demo followed by the location of the Docker file. Well, if you can notice here, the Docker file is present within the project. So that's why I have given dot here. So dot means the current working directory, and the Docker file is present within a current directory. That's why we have given a dot over here. All right, next hit enter. So this will build a Docker image by using a Docker file. Well, notice here the build instructions: load build definition from Docker file, and Eclipse Tamarind image is pulled from the Docker registry. Next, created the working directory in a container. Next, copied this jar file from our project into container. Next, the image is exported and layers are also exported. Alright, so it means that the step-by-step instructions are executed, and finally the Docker image has built and stored in a local machine. So if you want to check whether the Docker image is created and stored in a local machine, we can just type the command docker images. So this will give a list of Docker images in our machine. For example, look at here, Spring Boot Docker demo. So this is the Docker image that we have built using Dockerfile, and notice here the tag name latest. Well, we haven't given a tag name while building the Docker image. That's why by default the Docker added the tag name as a latest, and this is the image ID, and this is the created time, the image created time, and this is the size of the Docker image. Okay, next what we can do is we can also add a tag to the Docker image as well. So let's see how to do that. Just type the command docker build -t. So -t option we use to provide a tag name to the Docker image, and then followed by Spring Boot Docker demo. So this is the image name, followed by colon, and then we need to provide a tag name. For example, let's say 0.1.release. So this is the tag name that we are giving to this Docker image. Okay, next let's go ahead and hit enter. So this will build a Docker image with this tag name. Okay, now the Docker image is built. Next, let's see the list of images. Just type the command. So let me clear the terminal first and just type the command docker images. So this will display all the images in our machine, and if you can notice here, Spring Boot Docker demo is the image name, and the tag is 0.1.release, and then created time is 19 minutes ago. So notice here we have a Docker image. It has different tags. Okay, so this is how we can use the docker build command to build the Docker image with tag. Okay, in next lecture we will see how to run the Docker image in a Docker container. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture. Hi everyone, welcome back. In previous lecture we have seen how to build a Docker image from a Docker file, and also we have seen how to provide a tag name to the Docker image. For example, let's go to terminal, and we have used the command docker build -t followed by the Docker image name and then working directory. So basically we have used this docker build command to build this Docker image from the Docker file, and then we have used docker build -t Spring Boot Docker demo is the Docker image name, followed by the tag name. So we have used this command to build the Docker image with tag. Okay, in this lecture we will see how to run a Docker image in a Docker container by using docker run command. Okay, so let's go to a terminal, and here let me list out the Docker images first. So just type the command docker images. So this will display all the images in our system. So if you can notice here, we have Spring Boot Docker demo image. It has 2 tags. Next, let's go ahead and let's see how to run Docker image in a Docker container. So let's type the command docker run and then followed by -p. So -p is to map the port. So basically we need to map the container port with host operating system port. For example, 8080:8080. So this 8080 is basically a port for host operating system, and this 8080 is a port of container. Well, basically container has its own private network, and in order to access that network we have to expose the port to the host operating system. So that is what we are doing over here. So we are mapping the container port with host operating system port. Okay, so if we map the port like this, then we can able to access the container private network by using this exposed port, that is 8080. Alright, great. Next, followed by the image name. So image name in our case, Spring Boot Docker demo. So let me copy this image name and paste it over here. Okay, so this is the docker run command that we use to run a Docker image in a Docker container. So just hit enter. Next, let's go to browser and let's call the REST API. So let's go to browser. In a new tab, just type localhost :8080/docker, hit enter, and there we go. The client got the response of the REST API. Okay, next let's go to terminal, and here just press Ctrl+C to kill the Docker instance. Okay, so if you are using Windows, then just press Ctrl+C. Okay, now we have stopped the Docker container, and in order to check whether the Docker containers are running or not, for that we can just type the command docker ps. So let me clear first the terminal and just type the command docker ps to check the running containers. As of now, there are no running containers. Okay, next let's type the command docker run followed by -p and then 8081 and then 8080. Well, notice here we are mapping the container port 8080 with the host OS port 8081 and then followed by the image name, that is Spring Boot Docker demo, and hit enter. So notice here the port mapping, we are mapping the container port 8080 with the host OS port 8081, and in order to access our Spring Boot application we have to use the host OS port, that is 8081. Okay, for example, if you go to browser and just try to access localhost 8080/docker, it won't access because we have exposed the port 8080 with 8081, right? So we have to use 8081 port over here. Okay, so there we go, we got the response of the REST API. So this is how we need to map the container port with the host OS port. Alright, next let's see how to run the Docker container in a background. So just press Ctrl+C. So this will stop the Docker container. Next let's see how to run a Docker container in a detached mode. Detached mode meaning at a background. Okay, so here let me clear the terminal and just type the command docker run and then -p followed by the port mapping 8081:8080 and then followed by -d. So -d option is for to run the Docker container in a detached mode. Detached mode meaning the Docker container will basically run at a background. Okay, so next hit enter. Alright, next we can use docker logs command to see the logs of the Docker container. For example, here just type the command docker logs and then -f to tail the logs and then followed by the Docker ID. So instead of giving this whole Docker ID, we can just provide first 4 digit, that is 1424, and hit enter, and there we go. You can able to see the logs of our Spring Boot application. Okay, next let's go to browser and let's access the REST API. So here I'm going to access the REST API, and there we go. You can able to see the logs over here. Well, basically we have provided -f option in a command to tail the logs. That's why you can see all the logs over here. Okay, next just press Ctrl C if you are using Mac operating system. If you are using Windows, press Ctrl C. It will just exit the process, but it won't stop the Docker container. Okay, so if you just type the command docker ps, it will list all the running Docker containers. And notice here the Docker container is running. Okay, we haven't stopped the Docker container because we are running the Docker container in the background. So in order to stop the Docker container, we have to type the command docker stop followed by the Docker container ID, that is 1424. So you can just enter first 4 digit and hit enter. So this will stop the Docker container. Okay, so these are the couple of commands that we can use to play with Docker containers. Alright, so in this lecture we have seen how to run a Docker image in a Docker container. Alright, in next lecture we will see how to push a Docker image from a local machine into a Docker hub. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture. Hi everyone, welcome back. In previous lecture we have seen how to run a Docker image in a Docker container. In this lecture we will see how to push a Docker image from our system into a Docker hub. Well, in order to push a Docker image from our local machine into a Docker hub, you need to first create an account in a Docker hub. For example, if you go to browser and just type Docker hub in a new tab and click on this first link, so this will navigate to hub.docker.com. So in order to push Docker images to the Docker hub registry, you need to first register to this Docker registry. Well, Docker hub is nothing but a Docker registry where we can store the Docker images as a repositories. Well, in order to push the Docker images in a Docker hub, first you need to register. So just click on register and go ahead and enter username, email ID and password. Okay, so once you create a Docker account, then you can use this username as a Docker ID to push the Docker images as a repositories. Okay, well, I have already created a Docker account and I just logged into Docker hub over here, and if you can notice here a couple of repositories in a Docker hub. Well, here Java guides is nothing but my username or a Docker ID, and within this Docker ID you can see list of repositories. So these repositories are nothing but a Docker images, and these Docker images are associated with number of tags. Okay, so the Docker image can contain a number of tags over here as per the release. Okay, so this is how the repositories looks in a Docker hub. Well, whenever we push a new image to the Docker hub, then a new repository will be created under Docker ID, and the repository name should be same as image name. Okay, and you can also create a new repository by using this create repository button over here, and then you can push the image name to this particular repository. Okay, next let's go and let's see how to push an image to the Docker hub, and then we'll log in into Docker hub and then we'll see the repository. Okay, so let's go to terminal over here, and here let's type the command clear to clear the terminal, and here let me type the command Docker images to list all the images. So here we have two Docker images, we have one Docker image with 2 tags. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's push the Docker image to the Docker hub. Well, in order to push a Docker image from our system into a Docker hub, first we need to log into Docker through terminal. So here just type the command docker login. It will ask a username and password. Just provide a Docker hub username and password over here. Alright, now I have already logged into Docker, that's why you can able to see login succeeded. So once you enter username and password, then you can able to see login succeeded. Okay, next we are good to push a Docker image to the Docker hub. Well, in order to push the local Docker image into Docker Hub, first we need to associate this local Docker image with the repository on a Docker Hub. Okay, so in order to do that, let's type the command docker tag followed by the local Docker image name, that is Spring Boot Docker demo. So let me copy this, paste it over here, and then followed by the repository on Docker Hub. So here just type Java guides is the Dockerizing followed by, so we are going to create a repository with the name as Spring Boot Docker and then demo. So this is the repository that will create in a Docker Hub. Okay, and this repository will be created under the Docker ID Java guides. Alright, make sure that you replace the Docker ID from Java guides with whatever the Docker ID you have. Okay, and next followed by we need to also add the tag name for this repository. So here let me give tag name something like 0.1.release. Okay, so this is the command that we need to tag the local Docker image with the repository on a Docker Hub. Okay, so if you can go to Docker Hub, so we have Java guides as a Docker ID. So under this Java guides Docker ID, the repository will be created with the name Spring Boot Docker demo. Okay, and then this repository will contain this Docker image. Okay, next just hit enter. Now we have associated the local Docker image with the repository in a Docker Hub. Next let's enter the command to push this Docker image to Docker Hub. So if you just enter the command docker images, you can able to see here the repository Java guides / Spring Boot Docker demo. Okay, so this is a Docker ID and then this is a repository name. Next we are good to push this Docker image on a Docker Hub. Alright, so here just type the command docker push and then followed by the repository name. So let me copy this and paste it over here, and then we can also have a tag name, that is 1.0.release. So let me copy this tag and here colon and then paste this tag over here. Okay, now this is the command that we use to push the local repository into a Docker Hub repository. Okay, next hit enter and notice here the push refers to repository, this repository. Okay, so it will take a couple of seconds to push the image from local machine into a Docker Hub. And there we go, the push is completed. Next, in order to verify the Docker image is pushed to Docker Hub or not, let's go to Docker Hub. So go to browser and go to Docker Hub and just log in to Docker Hub if you are not logged in. And there we go, Spring Boot Docker demo repository is created under Java guides Docker ID, and this repository contains a Docker image. And just click on this repository, and if you can notice here the tags 0.1.release. So this is the tag we have provided while pushing a Docker image to the Docker Hub. Okay, so this is how we can push Docker image from our system into a Docker Hub. Alright, well, let me recap what we have done in this lecture. We have created a Docker account in a Docker Hub. Next, we have logged into Docker using Docker login command, and then we have associated the local Docker image with the repository on a Docker Hub. For example, we have used the command docker tag and followed by the local Docker image name and then followed by the repository on Docker Hub in this format. Okay, so Docker ID followed by the repository and then followed by the tag name. So this repository basically contains this Docker image name. Okay, next we have used docker push command to push the Docker image into Docker Hub. So these are the couple of steps that we have performed in order to push an image from local machine into a Docker Hub. Okay, great. I hope you understood how to create a Spring Boot application and how to create a Docker file and how to build a Docker image from the Docker file and how to run a Docker image in a Docker container and how to push a Docker image into a Docker Hub. Hi everyone, welcome back. In previous lecture we have seen how to push a local Docker image in a Docker Hub. In this lecture we will see how to pull a Docker image from the Docker Hub and run that Docker image in a Docker container. Well, if you can see the general Docker workflow here, so once we push the Docker image in a Docker Hub, then we can pull that Docker image from the Docker Hub and we can deploy in different environments. Okay, so in this lecture, let's see how to pull a Docker image from the Docker Hub and run that Docker image in a Docker container. So let me go to Docker Hub over here and let me log in into Docker Hub account, and here you can see I have a couple of repositories in a Docker Hub, and now let me show you how to pull the Docker repositories from Docker Hub. So here let me pull this repository, that is Java Guides / Spring Boot Docker Demo. So Spring Boot Docker Demo is a repository under Java Guides Docker ID. Okay, so in order to pull this repository or a Docker image, we need to enter this entire path. Okay, for example, if you go to terminal and just enter docker pull command over here, let's say docker pull and then followed by Java Guides is a Docker ID and then followed by the image name or the repository name, for example Spring Boot Docker Demo, and hit enter, and look at here, by default it will look for the tag with the name latest. So here we got the error because the latest tag is not exist. For example, if you go to Docker Hub over here and if you go to tags for this repository, you can see the tag present is 0.1.release. there is a no latest tag present for this repository. Okay, so just type this tag in a command. Let me re-enter the command docker full followed by Java Guides / Spring Boot Docker Demo and then followed by the tag that is 0.1.release. Hit enter, and there we go. Now we can able to successfully pull this Docker image or repository from the Docker Hub. Okay, and here just type the command docker images to just check whether the image is present in a local machine or not. Okay, so images already exist, so let me pull another Docker image. For example, if you go to Docker Hub and here just search for one of the Docker image. For example, let me pull MySQL Docker image. So just go to Docker image, official image, and let me go to tags over here and let me pull the MySQL Docker image with latest tag. Okay, so just go to terminal, here just type docker pull followed by MySQL and then followed by the tag that is latest and then hit enter, and here you can see it will take a couple of seconds to pull the Docker image from the Docker Hub. Now you can able to see downloaded newer image for this particular repository. Okay, in order to check whether this image is downloaded in our machine or not, we just type the command docker images, and there we go. Repository is MySQL and tag is latest. Okay, so here let me clear it and let me pull one more image. So here let me pull MariaDB Docker image and go to official Docker image over here and go to tags. So let's pull MariaDB latest. Okay, so go to terminal and here just type the command docker pull and followed by MariaDB and then latest. So if you don't mention the latest tag, then by default it will pull the MariaDB image with latest tag. Okay, so hit enter, and if you can notice here using default tag latest, so we haven't mentioned the tag in a command, that's why by default it is using latest tag. Okay, so it will take couple of seconds to pull this MariaDB image from the Docker Hub. So just wait for a couple of seconds, and there we go. You can able to see the status downloaded newer image for MariaDB latest. Okay, so in order to check whether this image is present in our local machine or not, just type the command docker images, and there we go. You can able to see MariaDB latest, and this image is created 7 days ago. So this is how we pull the Docker image from the Docker Hub. Next, let me show you how to run one of the Docker image in a Docker container. So let's see how to run this MySQL Docker image in a Docker container. Okay, so here let me quickly type the command docker run followed by -p option to map the port. So here we are mapping the container port with the host OS port and followed by the container name, that is localhost, and followed by we define some of the environment variables like the MySQL root password is MySQL @123 and then database name is employee underscore db, and then new user name is Ramesh, password is Ramesh, and here we need to provide the image name, that is MySQL latest. Alright, perfect. Next, so we are going to run this image in a detached mode, that's why -d option. Okay, next hit enter, and there we go, the MySQL image is successfully running in a MySQL container. Next, let's go ahead and let's type the command docker logs -f to tail the logs, and then followed by the container name, so that is localhost. So if you can notice here, we have given the container name, that is localhost, right? So notice here the option --name localhost. So localhost is basically a container name. Okay, next hit enter, and there we go, you can able to see the logs for MySQL database. Okay, next, if you want to check whether the MySQL database is running in a Docker container or not, so we just need to log in into MySQL database in a Docker container. So let me show you how to do that. So just press Ctrl C, and here just type the command docker exec, and then -it, and then followed by the container name, that is localhost, and then followed by bash. Hit enter, and there we go, you can able to see the bash over here. And within a bash, so let me first exit and clear the terminal so that you can see it better. So just type the command docker exec -it localhost bash, hit enter. So this will jump into bash bash terminal, bash shell basically, and here we can type the command MySQL -u for user, and then root, and then p, and then enter password, that is MySQL@123, and there we go, we can see the MySQL cell over here, and here just type show databases, and notice here employee underscore db database is successfully created. It means we have successfully deployed MySQL Docker image in a Docker container. Okay, so this is how we pull the Docker image from the Docker Hub and we run the Docker image in a Docker container. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture.